and in view of the fact that we seem to be trying to maintain normal relations with Chile in view of the changes in that government, are we thinking also about long range or short range normalizing our relations with Cuba?
Certainly not short range. As far as long range, until Cuba changes its policy toward us, we're not going to change our policy toward Cuba. Let me distinguish, Mr. Meyer, because coming from Miami, I know you have a big Cuban readership, and they're torn. I mean, they would like to be able to have some communication with their friends back in Cuba, and yet they're concerned about the government, as you well know how strong they feel. Chile has what is termed a communist-leaning government, at least. We'll call it a Marxist government. Allende is a Marxist with strong communist support. Now, as far as Chile is concerned, we don't particularly approve of that type of government. We wouldn't want it here. On the other hand, the Chilean people voted for it. So as far as our attitude toward Chile is concerned, it will be affected by what Chile's attitude is toward us. Now, if the Chilean government does things internally, that's their business and the business of the Chilean people. They voted the government in, they will have to live with it. If, however, they do things in Chile or outside of Chile in their foreign policy that is detrimental to us, then that's our business, and we will react accordingly. We're waiting to see what they will do. As long as they treat us properly, we'll treat them properly. Now let's look at Cuba. As far as Castro is concerned, he's already drawn the line. He's exporting revolution all over the hemisphere, still exporting it. His line is against the United States, not only within Cuba, but outside of Cuba. And as long as Castro is adopting an antagonistic, anti-American line, we are certainly not going to normalize our relations with Castro. As soon as he changes his line toward us, we might consider it. But it's his move.
Mr. President?
Yes.
J. Edgar Hoover very recently seems to have become one of the favorite whipping boys of a number of prominent Americans. Is there the slightest...
Yes, I'm glad to have somebody else there for a change.
Is there the slightest chance that the criticisms would hasten his retirement?
No. I think the criticisms, particularly when they're unfair, as many of them have been, and malicious, as many of them have been, and I haven't discussed Mr. Hoover's retirement with him. He has not brought it up with me. But if I know Mr. Hoover, such unfair and malicious criticisms would tend to have exactly the opposite effect, not to hasten his retirement, but to have him dig in. And I could only say this, that with regard to Mr. Hoover, that I would ask the editors of the nation's papers to be fair about the situation. He, like any man who is a strong man and an able man or who has led this bureau for so many years, has made many enemies. But we can also be thankful that in the FBI, he has developed an organization which is recognized throughout the world as the best law enforcement agency in the world. He has been non-political. He has been non-partisan. And despite all of the talk about surveillance and bugging and the rest, let me say, I have been in police states. And the idea that this is a police state is just pure nonsense. And every editorial paper in the country ought to say that.
Well, Mr. President, earlier this week, I think speaking in Detroit, the Vice President said that he felt the director should remain on the job as long as he is physically and mentally sound. Is that more or less your attitude?
Well, Mr. Cormier, I am not going to discuss the situation with regard to Mr. Hoover's tenure in office when the matter has not been raised with me, either by me or by him. I will only say at this time that I believe it would be most unfortunate to allow a man who has given 50 years, over 50 years of dedicated service to this country to go out under a cloud, maligned unfairly by many critics. Now, I don't mean that some criticism of him, of me, of anybody is not justified, but he's taking a bad rap on a lot of things, and he doesn't deserve it, and I'm going...
Mr. President, I'd like to change the subject, if we could, for a moment to the youth of America and ask you to give us your reading on the attitude and temperature of America's youth on our campuses. They apparently have turned away, at least in the recent months, from violence. They seem to be going about their education, and yet I wonder if there is even deeper despair on their minds than there was when they were practicing violence. Do you have any views on that, sir?
Well, Mr. Chandler, it always does my heart good when I look down on that beach that you and I share, and
we do? I can't surf there anymore, sir.
Like that. And see young America surfing and enjoying it. Seriously, the problem of American youth concerns us all, and I suppose that we concerned our parents. But youth today is a more difficult problem. There is more alienation. Well, spend a moment on it, if I could, analyzing it. One, all the old values aren't there anymore. The faith in religion, family ties, what they hear in the colleges and the universities generally is against the system. The system is bad, it pollutes the air, it's wrong to minorities, it's repressive, and of course it wages war. All of this concerns youth because youth basically, young people basically, by nature, by definition, and we all remember how we were, we tend to be idealistic and hopeful, and we want the world to be better. And so I think that young people, particularly in the 60s, the late 60s, fell into a period of great disillusionment. That disillusionment, of course, was certainly increased by what they heard in school, what they heard sometimes in their churches, maybe sometimes what they heard at home. Now, let's look to the future. We're removing some of the problems. As we end the involvement in the war, as the draft calls come to an end, which they will, as we have programs to deal with the problems of pollution of air and water, we're not going to solve it immediately, but we have programs to deal with it. As we make progress on the problems of minorities, and we are making progress, not enough, not as much as we would like, but we're making a lot of progress. And as we see in perspective, and if I may say so, what I really believe, what a really great and good country this is, I think we're going to find great numbers of American youth reestablishing their faith in America. You asked about a moment ago, Mr. Dickinson, the question, what do you think of when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and what you really want for this country? Well, what I want first and above all, of course, is to end the war that we're in and to build a lasting peace through what we're doing in China, the Soviet Union, the SALT talks, the Mideast. There are problems all over the world. But second, we want to build a new economy and a new prosperity which is not based on war. And third, we want to have a revolution in this country of government to make it more responsive, to make government work, to make it cost less. That's why we have revenue sharing and government reorganization. We want to reform our welfare system and all the rest. Now, I believe that if we can just make some progress on all these fronts, that the millions of young, idealistic Americans will take another look at America, and they'll say, well, maybe this system isn't hopeless. Maybe it is possible that it will work. Maybe the United States is, which I firmly believe, the world's best hope for peace and for freedom. That's what we are. And once American youth sees that, and once they see that their idealism can be fulfilled within the system, I think that this enormous frustration that is torn down can turn into creative activity that will build up. That's what I'd like to leave when I leave office, that kind of a feeling in American youth.
Mr. President, the economic activity in the first quarter, despite the rise in the GNP, apparently did not measure up to the expectations of your administration. Do you have new measures in mind in the battle against unemployment and inflation, or are you going to stick to the present game plan?
Well, Mr. Dickinson, I've analyzed those figures pretty closely, and while, as you do point out, it did not reach the projections of our own economic target. It was far above the projections of people like Otto Eckstein, who said 22 billion. We went to 28.5 billion. But let me be quite objective about it. We all know that when we look at that, what was the gross largest increase in the GNP in any one quarter in history, that part of that is due to inflation, and part of it is due to the comeback, the snapback from the auto strike. But why I am optimistic about the economy has to do with what went into that figure. Let's look at the real numbers. Automobile sales. Automobile sales in the first 10 days of this year, GM, the highest on record, the highest in history. In the first quarter, the highest in about 20 years. Housing starts. Housing starts in the first quarter, the highest in 20 years, and the figure just announced today, 1,900,000 in the month of March. Retail sales. This may not be reflected in advertising, but it'll come. Just keep going. But retail sales. We find that retail sales went up a big 9.5%. But look what that retail sales was. It wasn't just the Easter bulge, because Easter was late and it was a cold spring. But it was in those things that really build an economy for the future. Appliances, home furnishings, and the rest. And then, to take another number, the stock market. Now, the stock market, we all think, is just something for the rich, but there are 27 million people in the market, apart from those that are in institutions. I understand about 11 months ago, a few went into institutions, too. But when we look at those that are affected by the market, approximately 60 million Americans are investors in the stock market, either through insurance companies or funds or directly. And what do we find? We find that the stock market had the biggest growth in the last 11th month, 50% gain. Now, people do not buy stocks because they are pessimistic about the future. What I am saying this, the consumers in America now have confidence. I believe we're going to see that confidence grow in April, May, June. If that confidence grows, the economy will grow with it. And I would say that at this time, with the movement not being as fast as we had hoped, but with the movement sharply up in the last week in March and the first 2 weeks of April, that my predictions of a good year in 1971 and a very good year in 1972 still stand, and I don't think we should change the plan now. We will continue to wage the battle against inflation by holding spending within the full employment surplus, within the full employment revenue, and we will continue, of course, to do everything that we can with pockets of unemployment, like in Southern California and the Northeast, where we have airframe and other unemployment. But I believe that at this time, we are going to see a strong second half particularly, and a very, very strong 1972. I'm speaking, of course, economically.
Mr. President, this is a new question. Don't want to step on the applause. But inasmuch as this is an editor's convention, I think it would be inappropriate not to discuss the criticism which has been made of the press, particularly by the Vice President, who is now not only criticizing our viewpoint, but analyzing some of our stories in detail. I was wondering, quite apart from his prowess as a golfer, if you would care to compare his abilities as Vice President and as editor. And as editor for the nation's press, do you think that the Vice President is better as a Vice President or as an editor?
You mean you're looking for an editor? Mr. Dedman, I'm going to make an offer to these distinguished publishers, editors, and so forth that are here. I have had the privilege of being before, in your office too, been in editorial conferences with every paper represented here. I'd like for all of you to have the Vice President in. See what kind of a man he really is. The trouble is he only makes news when he hits the press or a golf ball. And what you... And here is a man, yes, he's controversial. He says what he thinks, and he says it very hard. As a matter of fact, I believe that some of his criticisms if you look at them very objectively, some of the criticisms that he's made in terms of some network coverage and press coverage, you really cannot quarrel with. If you examine the whole record, I believe that the Vice President's national image of simply being a man who's against a free press, who's against all the press, is just not accurate. The difficulty is that he is not known. The things that he does, his capability in the foreign field, his capability in the domestic field. He's one of the best salesmen we have for revenue sharing because he knows what local government is. He was a governor, and he also was a county official. And all over this country, he goes out and makes effective speeches. They get 2 sticks backs with the corset ads. They never get up there on the front page. So, I guess you don't advertise corsets anymore, though. That's different. But nevertheless, I'm simply saying this. Simply saying that this old game, and Frank Cormier and Gene Risch have heard me say this often to the White House press corps, of having the president disagree with his vice president, goes on and on. But I'm an expert at it, and I'm not going to get into it. I defend my vice president. Mr. Chandler.
Could I ask a follow-up question on the Vice President? Do you think seriously, sir, in his attacks on the press, that they have been successful in causing any change, in your opinion, for the better in the press? In other words, have his attacks been successful? Has the press reacted in a positive way, in your opinion? If so, how?
I suppose that's the dilemma, isn't it, of anyone who dares to criticize the press or the television, that if he does, he is probably going to get worse treatment than he thought he was getting before. And of course, I'm being very guarded, as you notice. I will simply say this, Mr. Chandler. You may recall that back in 1962, immediately after running for governor of California, after I was out of office and had no visible prospects of success, I had some things to say about the press. I have had nothing to say about it since. That's my answer. Gene Richard.
I'd like to get back to Mr. Hoover and the FBI.
Yeah, sure.
Do you, is there any credence to the complaints by some congressmen, as far as you know, that they are under surveillance by the FBI?
Well, Mr. Risher, let me answer that question in terms of what I know, because I checked this personally. I was in the House. I was in the Senate. And I am very jealous of the right of senators and congressmen and every citizen, actually, not to have surveillance when he's engaged in public activities. Particularly, I can assure you that there is no question in my mind that Mr. Hoover's statement that no telephone in the Capitol has ever been tapped by the FBI is correct. Not since 1920. That is correct. The case you refer to, the Dowdy case, did not involve the tapping of a congressman's telephone. The second point that I should make is this. Let's get this whole business of surveillance and the rest into some perspective. First, when we talk about police state, there are 205 million people in this country. Did you know, even the nation's editors, sophisticated as you are, that over the past 2 years, there were only 300 taps by the FBI through court orders. You know what accomplished from those taps? There were 900 arrests and 100 convictions, and particularly convictions in the important area of narcotics, where millions and millions of dollars worth of narcotics that otherwise would have gone to the young people of America were picked up. That was why those taps were carried on. Now let's talk about the other area, which I think Mr. Risher people are more concerned about. They say, what about the taps that are not made by court order, but that are made for the national security? I checked that too. The high, insofar as those taps are concerned, were in the years 1961, 1962, and 1963. In those years, the number of taps was between 90 and 100. Now, in the 2 years that we have been on office, now get this number, the total number of taps for national security purposes by the FBI, and I know because I look at not at the information, but of the decisions that are made. The total number of taps is less, has been less than 50 a year, a cut of 50% from what it was in 1961, 62, 63. As far as Army surveillance is concerned, once we saw what had happened at the Democratic National Convention, that had even been carried to the surveillance of Adlai Stevenson, who later became a senator, we stopped it. And I simply want to put this all in perspective by saying this. I believe the nation's press has a responsibility to watch government, to see that Big Brother isn't watching. I don't want to see a police state. I argue the right of privacy case in the Supreme Court, and I feel strongly about the right of privacy. But let's also remember that the President of the United States has a responsibility for the security of this country and a responsibility to protect the innocent from those who might engage in crime or which would be dangerous to the people of this country. And in carrying out that responsibility, I defend the FBI in this very limited exercise of tapping. One final point. You talk about police state. Let me tell you what happens when you go to what is really a police state. You can't talk in your bedroom. You can't talk in your sitting room. You don't talk on the telephone. You don't talk in the bathroom. As a matter of fact, you hear about going out and talking in the garden. Yes, I've walked many times through gardens in various places where I had to talk about something confidential, and you can't even talk in front of a shrub. That's the way it works. What I'm simply saying is this, my friends. There are police states. We don't want that to happen to America. But America is not a police state. And as long as I am in this office, we are going to be sure that not the FBI or any other organization engages in any activity except where the national interest or the protection of innocent people requires it. And then it will be as limited as it possibly can be. That's what we're going to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you.